1.9 million Kiwis don't own a house. That's about a third of the entire country. And the reason sounds simple at first, right? House prices are too high. But as you're about to see, that's not the full story. So in this episode of the Property Academy podcast, you're going to learn the 3 real reasons why 1.9 million Kiwis don't own a house and why lower house prices won't magically fix the problem.
Thing is, Andrew, home ownership is sitting at about 66% in New Zealand. It's actually gone up over the last 5 years. It used to be down at 64.5%. It has gone up to 66%. That's really good. But it is down from the record high back in 1991. Home ownership peaked just under 74%. So you've seen it drop about 8 percentage points since then. And if you think there's about 5.3 million Kiwis in New Zealand, multiply that by 34%, the ones that don't own a home, then you're talking about roughly 1.9 million New Zealanders who don't own a home at the moment. And when you think about, well, why is that the case? I know a lot of people initially will think about greedy landlords or very, very high house prices. And both of those, might be kind of true. But I also wanted to dig into the data and find out if it's true, because I think as we've seen, having looked at the data before we hit record, the story is a bit more complicated than that. So when you think about why is it that almost 2 million Kiwis don't own a home, what's the first factor?
Well, I think the first thing is that houses are expensive, right? And when you talk about house affordability, I think it's more than just saying they're expensive. There are 3 parts to that. Firstly, house prices are high. So they've gone up faster than people's income. So when you think about, what's that data, from 2000 to 2025, house prices have gone up about 4.7 times what they were back in 2000. Now, incomes are only up 2.7 times in that same period of time.
Yeah, so house prices are 4.7 times what they were in the year 2000 compared to incomes, which are only 2.7 times what they were back then.
I was actually surprised at that because I thought incomes had increased at a higher rate. I thought they were closer to 4.7 times as well.
Well, no, if you think about income since the year 2000, the average household income back then was around $50,000.
Now, hang on, is that household income or income?
Household income.
Okay.
So household income has gone from about 50K up to about 132.5K. So it's actually gone up quite a lot in the last 25 years. We're talking here about roughly about an $80,000 increase in household incomes over the last 25 years. But if your income or your household income's gone from, call it, 50 back in 2000, household income might have been 50K and a house might have cost you 175K. So that ratio between house prices to household income was about 3.5 times. Whereas today your household income might be 135K, but the house is maybe 800K. So the ratio is closer to 6 times. But affordability isn't just about house prices versus incomes. Like, there are a couple of other factors that I think people often forget about.
Yeah, I think a big thing is the way that banks look at an application when you take out a mortgage. When you think about back when I bought my first ever property, when was it? Do you remember?
2003.
See, I love that.
You're so old that you don't even remember.
I basically have to consult him about what I did. And every now and then he tells me a story about something in my life. I'm basically like a dementia patient being reminded of my life. So anyway, back then.
Do you remember that, Grandpa? You bought your house in 2003 for a couple of raspberries.
And of course, you only needed a 5% deposit. So that was relatively easy to achieve. Like, you could save a 5% deposit, whereas these days, very few home buyers, first home buyers, would actually do that. Most of them would actually have a 10% deposit, or more likely actually a 20% deposit. So about 60% of first home buyers have a 20% deposit. So when you think about, okay, well, house prices are up and you need a higher percentage, or generally speaking, you'd have a higher percentage, that makes quite a big difference and probably means that people have to save for longer before buying their first house.
Well, even if you disregard that house prices have gone up for a second, which of course they have, if you just look at the bank lending changes, you need about 4 times the deposit today as you did roughly about 20 years ago, because the bank criteria has changed. Now, we're all aware that house prices have gone up, and that is part of unaffordability. The other part, though, is the bank criteria, because it's made it 4 times harder to get into your first home because the deposit you need is 4 times higher. Now, of course, some people are able to use a 10% deposit. About 40%, 42% of first home buyers do use less than a 20% deposit. But there's no beating around the bush. It is harder to get a deposit today than it was back 20 years ago. And it's not just because of high house prices, it's also because of the bank criteria. And then there's also the issue just generally about getting your mortgage approved. It is undoubtedly harder to get a mortgage approved today than it was 5 years ago because of the triple CFA rules, even though they have been rolled back. And it is definitely, or it definitely was harder to get a mortgage approved 5 years ago compared to 15 years ago. I mean,
It
this, right?
It was so much easier. Like I think about back when I was a rookie at the BNZ and going around with Tony Mounts and him filling out a 4-page application. One of those pages was just the declaration and the signatures. The rest of it was scribbled in about 3 minutes on the back of his car. And then like by the time he'd driven back to the office, he'd already decided he was going to approve it. And that was it. Like it was so easy.
Now, the tougher criteria for banks approving a mortgage, some of that is like down to really good things. You don't want to be out there, or the banks don't want to be out there approving mortgages for people who really ought not to get that mortgage approved. But the unintentional consequence of tightening up that criteria is it does make it harder, especially to buy your first house. And there's also a problem with that number that I said, 1.9 million Kiwis not able to buy a home. Actually, it's a lot higher than that, because if I think about people these days are much more likely to live with their parents. So if I think about my ex-girlfriend, right? So she was living, I mean, I shouldn't keep bringing her up on the show,
honestly,
Andrew, but here we go. I'm married, so I've definitely moved on.
Who are you convincing?
I don't know, myself.
You're going to get in trouble for that one.
Oh, maybe. Oh. Luckily, my wife doesn't watch the show, but somebody will send it to her. So if I think about her, just because it's a useful example, she was living with her parents, right? Now, according to the stats, she counts in home ownership.
Really?
Because the question that the census asks is they have one form per household, and they say, does somebody in this house own it, or is it within a family trust? Now, in that case, you know, she lived in the house, she didn't own it, but her parents owned it. And so, oh, cool, tick, right, that house is owned by somebody there. So it counts as the home ownership stats. So when we talk about 66% home ownership rate, that's actually not 66% of New Zealanders, it's 66% of the residential dwellings that people live in. But actually, you can't just apply that to, there's 5.3 million New Zealanders, so, 1.9 million don't. The number's higher than that, because if I'm still living with my mum, which I'm not, by the way, that's me convincing myself again, I would, in that back of the envelope calculation, I would count as a homeowner, but actually I'm not. It's my mum who owns the house in that case.
I actually think that another consideration there, though, is when I was up until 5 years ago, I didn't own my own home. I lived in
loser.
I rented a house. I was a rent-vestor. And there are so many people that choose that way of life nowadays because we want a bit more flexibility with being able to move to different parts of the country or different parts of the world. So for me, I wanted to rent an apartment in the inner city, which I thought would be a terrible investment, but buy investment properties. So I had, 20 properties at the time. But I would have been considered one of those very unfortunate people that was not a homeowner.
Yeah, because when you ticked the box on the census, I bet you're the sort of person.
I never did this.
Yeah, you're the
can
sort
you
of.
say that? It's illegal, isn't it?
It is illegal, but we're going to keep that in.
No, I did the census.
No, people need to know.
When I ticked the thing, the census a census taker once tried to test me.
And you would have ticked the box that no, for the house that I live in, I don't own this. It's not owned in a family trust. And so you would have been counted as someone who doesn't own their own home, even though you were a property owner. And so it's very important that people understand that home ownership, as Stats New Zealand reports it, and property ownership are actually two very different things. But another reason why home ownership is declining is kind of structural.
Yeah, I think people settle down later now, right? I mean, what was the age that you'd get married, 40 years ago?
So if you think back in the 70s, the average age that a woman got married was 21. For a guy, it's 23.
And how old are you and Angela?
33. So I am 32 and she is 29. But these days, the average age for a girl is 30, and for a guy, I believe it's 32.
And if you think about it, like if people are going to settle down later, that's when they're more likely to have a double income house and more likely to buy a property and put down their roots. And if you're going, more people go to university now. So as a result, we start working later, we get married later, and this kind of all compounds to a reason why you wouldn't get into your first home until much later. So I think that kind of sways the numbers. So if you're going to compare apples for apples, you'd probably want to do it based on age.
Well, that's the thing. This is why the average age of a first home buyer is about 36 these days. And the way that settling down later actually turns into a lower home ownership rate is that if people buy their first home at 36 rather than 26, then a larger share of the population doesn't own a home at any one time. Because if you think about all of the people in New Zealand aged 0 to 26, for instance, that's a big group. And then if you think about all of the people aged 26 to 36, well, that's another larger group of people again. So if people do buy their own home, but they decide to make that decision later, or a combination of lifestyle factors and high house prices mean that people do it later, that can cause the overall home ownership rate to decrease, even though you might end up with the same number of people owning a home later on. And in fact, if you look at people who are in their 70s, I think something like high 80% of people own their own home.
That's quite a big, that's way higher than I would have expected.
So it's not that people won't ever buy their own homes, is that it might just happen a little later on. Some of that is high house prices. I don't want to diminish that, but some of it is lifestyle. If you settle down later on, if you start working later on, then you will typically delay home ownership. Now, that's not me slapping your hand, oh, how dare you, you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that is one of the factors that is often not discussed when it comes to New Zealand's declining home ownership rate. And if you think about that swing, so we've gone from, call it 74% home ownership to 66% home ownership. That is an 8 percentage point decrease in the last just over 3 decades. I think it's about 33 years. Some of it is absolutely down to higher house prices, but some of it is also down to the changing of the bank lending rules, and some of it is down to structural changes in people's lifestyle, like saying, I'm going to delay home ownership rather than saying no to it forever. Some of it is how the data is captured, like your example about rent-vestors. It ain't down to just one factor. And another one that really surprised me when I was thinking about, what are some of the dataisms or the quirks in terms of how the data is captured. And an unexpected one is old people. So we've got about 470 retirement villages in New Zealand. There's about 53,000 residents. And as we live longer, more people are moving into retirement homes. I think, most people would be like, yes, that makes sense. But what you don't...
Oh, yeah. Is that considered home ownership?
Well, that's the thing. If you buy a retirement unit, you don't own that. You're not buying the property. You are buying a license to occupy the property. And so if you live in a retirement home and more people live in retirement homes, you might have paid a lot of money to live there, but you don't own that. You're not a homeowner. Now, it does come down to, in terms of Stats NZ's numbers, what box do retirees tick? Some of them might accidentally think they're a homeowner, but they're actually not. Others would say, well, actually, I don't own this. I've bought a license to occupy. And, old people, they tend to read the fine print, so they're probably more aware of that, if I can say that. I don't think you'll get too many hate comments about that on YouTube, but here we go. And so if you see a larger percentage of retirees living in retirement homes because they're older, we've got an aging population, you're going to see even more of that, well, then you could have the home ownership stats go down, fewer Kiwis owning their own home. But actually, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just in terms of how the data is captured and an active choice. People selling their homes to then move into a retirement village. And so you just want to always think about how are the statistics calculated, because that is a little dataism. It's a little quirk in how the data is captured. But actually, you could see a declining home ownership, and it might not necessarily tell you the story it initially does.
So I guess the key message is that the home ownership rate as a percentage is not necessarily going to tell the whole story, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that it's just down to house prices, because we've just seen house prices fall 27% in Wellington. In Auckland, it's been close. I think at the maximum it was about 22, 23%. So we saw house prices really come down. And if that was the only factor holding home ownership back, then you would expect to see first home buyers really buying up large. Now, you saw a little bit of that. First home buyers during this downturn have made up a slightly higher share of the market.
But that might have been also because investors dropped out, right?
Well, all I'm saying is it hasn't been night and day.
Yes.
If we look at investors and first home buyers, when investors buy more homes, they do it because the market's hot. That's when first home buyers step forward. When the market's cold, all buyer groups step back. And all I'm saying is if it was only down to high house prices, well, if we saw house prices drop by more than a quarter like we did, why didn't the first home buyers step forward and buy a massive share of the market? Actually, they were still down around that 25% mark, only making up about a quarter. Now, there was an increase, but it wasn't like, oh, wow, we've seen house prices drop a huge amount. We're all going to step forward. They're making up 40% or 30% or 50% of the market. So I'm just saying it can't all be down to high house prices. It's about all of these factors coming together that are contributing to that lower home ownership stats. Now, having said that, it is not all doom and gloom. If I look at ANZ's affordability index, we can see that, yes, during 2021, housing affordability really deteriorated. It became way more expensive. But actually, since then, it's come down a bit. We've seen housing become more affordable. If we look at their forecasts, they expect by 2026, 2027, that will only be about 7 or 8% more unaffordable compared to 2005 when they started tracking this.
Now, when they say affordability, is that just talking about price or is that talking about the cost of lending as well?
It's also talking about the cost of lending
Right.
because we've seen interest rates change. Because if you think about affordability, it's how long does it take to save your deposit?
100%.
It's the interest rate that you're going to pay. It's the servicing test interest rate you're going to pay. Yes, it's the price of the house. It's also your income. It's lots of factors that all come through together. And so it's good to see that actually the numbers and the forecasts suggest we're not going to be that much more unaffordable, only about 7 or 8% more unaffordable compared to 2020. That's according to ANZ's data. But if we take a broad step back and we think, well, what's the solution to all of this, to New Zealand's housing ownership potential issue?
Well, I think one of the big ones is actually having a decent supply of properties. And the way that you have more suppliers, you have more developers build things. And look, that's why personally, as an investor, my focus is on new builds because I want to add to the stock. I don't want to just be taking properties away from first home buyers and then be accused of being one of those landlords that's just pushing people out of the market. If I add stock to the market, that helps with this whole thing. And the other part, I do think we need to rethink what home ownership looks like or property ownership looks like. So again, going back to my situation where I owned property, I was in the property market, but I wouldn't be considered a homeowner. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, then we are saying that there's a problem when there isn't necessarily a problem for some people, right? And number 3, I think we really need to think about at what age we are looking at this data for people. So again, if we're starting the process of buying our first home later because of situations like us working overseas for a period of time, going to university more often, getting married later, then maybe we do need to be thinking about what is home ownership at say 50. Because at that stage, probably actually 80% of people are owning their own home, and so maybe the problem isn't as bad as what the numbers suggest.
And look, a fair criticism of our discussion so far could be like, oh, these guys are saying that actually it's not house prices that are causing home ownership to go down. Well, of course it is, Ed and Andrew. We're not saying that that's not an important factor, but we're just saying it's not 100% of the reason. Now, we can have a reasonable discussion about, well, how much of home ownership going down is down to house prices. I don't have a fixed number for that, but that's a reasonable discussion to have. But I think going through all of the stuff and the points that we have today, it's pretty clear New Zealand's declining home ownership is not all down or just down to high house prices. And actually, there is some good news when it comes to housing affordability. It is getting better. And we have seen home ownership increase over the last 5 years.
So that's why 1.9 million Kiwis don't technically own a house. But then this leads us to an even bigger question. Is owning a home even the right move for you? Because owning the roof over your head isn't the only path to getting rich. So in the next video, we're going to break down renting versus buying. What makes you richer? Click here to watch it now.